On this Independence Day weekend, perhaps it's an opportune time to reflect on dependence instead, on who or what we depend on who or what, to use the language from today's gospel, we choose to be yoked. Now, as we well know, living in St. Louis with the Budweiser Clydesdales, just a mile or so away from us, a yoke is a harness. In Jesus' time, they were made of wood. In fact, Jesus probably worked on yokes, being a carpenter or carpenter's son. And these yokes link together a pair of animals in order to create additional strength. And according to the internet, so of course it must be true because I looked it up, 2 horses yoked together have the strength of 4 horses, and 4 horses yoked together have the strength of 10. Now, whether or not the math is precisely correct, I don't know. That is what the internet said. But clearly, yoking animals together does give them additional strength. And I think likewise for us, what we are yoked to gives us additional strength. Strength for good, and also strength, unfortunately, for ill, for bad things. Now, there's an old adage, I think I've shared it with you before, God created humans in His image, and we keep repaying the favor. The point being that we have a tendency to remake God as we would have God appear, and not as God has revealed God's self to us. Likewise, we have a tendency, or at least I'll own my own stuff, I'll say I have a tendency to yoke myself to things that may lead me away from God and not towards God. And you can guess what those are. Things like money, possessions, wanting power, and things like that. But what do our readings today tell us about God? In our gospel, we hear Jesus say, "I give praise to you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, for although you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned, you have revealed them to little ones." And what has been revealed to little ones? To the simple. And it's really very profound, and for us it's kind of matter of fact, but it's very powerful. It's Jesus' relationship to God. Who is this Jesus who is teaching and preaching? That's what the crowds who are following him want to know. And here he is saying that Jesus is one with God, and we come to know God by knowing Jesus. Now, in our first reading today, the revelation we heard this morning from the prophet Zechariah, we see an image of God, or an image of God's Messiah, that is unexpected. Rejoice, the prophet says. Shout with joy. Here is what the Messiah is really like. How does he come to us? He comes meek and humble and riding on a donkey. And then Zechariah continues, he shall banish the chariot and the horse and the bow. So those are all implements of war or power. And God's Messiah comes to banish them, and comes preaching peace, proclaiming peace. And that is really unexpected. Likewise, in Jesus, we see a Messiah that was very unexpected. In fact, back at the beginning of this 11th chapter of Matthew's Gospel that we heard this morning, we read that way back in Advent. You might remember. We hear John the Baptist sending his disciples out to ask Jesus, "Are you the guy? Are you the one we've been waiting for, or should we look for another?" So even John the Baptist, who was the herald of the Messiah, was unsure, because Jesus was such an unexpected Messiah. Are you the one, he asks? And Jesus' answer is very telling. He says, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind regain their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the good news preached to them." I think it's a very simple message. If we want to find God, don't look to the top. As Father Richard Moore says, don't look to the top with the kings and the presidents and the rulers and riches. Look to the bottom, where the poor are, where the oppressed are, where the corporal and spiritual works of mercy are being practiced. And this reflected Jesus' personal experience. When Jesus says these words, he has before him these people he meets every day on the streets of Galilee, these simple people, the poor, the sick, the sinners, those who have been marginalized. And he also experiences that those in high office, the priests and the scribes, reject him. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Dorothy Day, Mother Teresa, the list goes on and on. All of the great saints are associated with the people at the bottom. The people struggling to survive, the people struggling for freedom, the people struggling for justice. In today's gospel, Jesus calls us to take on his yoke. Now, when Jesus was speaking to the people of his time, they were probably under two yokes. They were under a yoke of political oppression from the Romans, but they were also under a yoke of religious oppression because of the Pharisees and the scribes. And I think almost certainly Jesus is directing his comment to that religious oppression. The Pharisees had made God's law so oppressive that it excluded everybody but the perfect. And Jesus calls them and us to take on the yoke of a God that is gentle and peaceful and loving and forgiving. A very different God than the Pharisees. Now, this doesn't mean it isn't challenging. To take on Jesus' yoke is to learn to be gentle and humble in heart, as Jesus is. Jesus promises to give rest to his disciples, to us, but he also gives us an invitation, which is almost like a commandment. He says, take my yoke and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. As Pope Francis taught on this, and here I quote, Pope Francis said, the yoke of the Lord consists in taking on the burden of others with fraternal love. Once we have received Christ's comfort, we are called in turn to become a rest and comfort for our brothers and sisters, with a humble attitude in imitation of our teacher, the Lord. Close quote. To me, this means that likewise people should be looking for us at the bottom. This means people putting people's needs ahead of other concerns or requirements or expectations. The easy yoke that Jesus wore led him to challenge the oppressive yokes that people were wearing. And taking on his easy yoke is going to lead us to do the same thing. I think it's important to remember that wearing the easy yoke didn't lead Jesus down an easy path. And it may not lead us down one either. So on this Independence Day, let's reflect on what we are dependent upon. Let us examine the yokes that we have chosen. And I think in this amazing time, in our nation's history, a time that is really pregnant with new life, we're reminded anew of the inequalities among our brothers and sisters. And let us recommit ourselves to that yoke of Christ. Recommit ourselves to our brothers and sisters at the so-called bottom, and become rest and comfort for those who are oppressed.